I used to think nightmares were just dreams. Terrifying, sure, but ultimately harmless. That was before the faceless man started appearing. The first time I saw him was in a dream. Just a shadowy figure in the distance. I couldn't make out any details, but there was something profoundly wrong about him. He stood motionless, watching me from the edge of a foggy field, and though I couldn't see his face, I knew he was staring right at me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, but I brushed it off as just a bad dream. Everyone has nightmares, right? But the next night, the dream returned. This time, the faceless man was closer. I could see his outline more clearly. A tall figure, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothes. His face, or lack thereof, was smooth and featureless, a blank canvas where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He took a step toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I jolted awake, gasping for breath, but the fear lingered. Something about this dream was different, more intense, more real, and it didn't stop there. Night after night, the faceless man came closer, his presence more menacing, more suffocating. I tried everything to get rid of him, sleeping pills, meditation, even staying up all night, but nothing worked. He always found his way into my dreams, inching closer, closer. But the worst part, it wasn't just happening in my dreams anymore. I first noticed him during my morning commute. I was waiting at the bus stop when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there he was, standing across the street, motionless. My heart stopped. It was the faceless man, exactly as I'd seen him in my dreams. Tall, dressed in dark clothes. His face an eerie, featureless void. I blinked, and he was gone, as if he had never been there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I started seeing him everywhere, in crowds, reflected in windows, standing in dark alleys. He never moved, never approached, just watched. I'd feel his presence before I saw him, a cold shiver running down my spine, a sense of being hunted. And every time I saw him, he was closer than before. The worst encounter happened one evening when I was heading home. I was walking down a dimly lit street when the air around me grew cold, unnaturally cold, like a deep freeze in the middle of summer. I knew he was there before I even saw him. I turned around slowly, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my legs trembling. That's when he started moving. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost mocking. I turned and ran, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady, relentless. No matter how fast I ran, he was always just a few steps behind, like a predator toying with his prey. I turned down alleyways, darted through crowds, but nothing shook him. It was as if he could appear wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted. I burst into my apartment and slammed the door behind me, bolting it shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but what would I say? That a faceless man was stalking me. They'd think I was crazy. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I barely slept, barely ate, constantly on edge, waiting for him to appear again. I kept all the lights on, even during the day, but it didn't help. I could feel him watching me, lurking just out of sight. The nightmares grew worse, more vivid, more terrifying. In my dreams, he would chase me through endless corridors, dark forests, places that felt familiar but twisted wrong. And every time, he got closer. Desperation drove me to do something reckless. I began researching anything I could find about faceless entities, myths, legends, anything that might give me a clue about what was happening to me. I found stories of similar creatures, spirits, demons that stalked their victims, feeding off their fear, but nothing that matched my experience exactly. Still, I wasn't going to sit around and wait to be caught. I decided to confront him. That night, I set up cameras around my apartment, determined to capture proof of his existence. I armed myself with a knife, not that I knew if it would do any good, but it made me feel a little less helpless. Then I waited. Hours passed and nothing happened. I began to doubt myself, to wonder if maybe this was all in my head. But then, just as I was about to give up, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath fogged in the air, and a deep, primal fear gripped me. I knew he was here. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence. My heart pounded in my ears as I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness, he stepped into view. The faceless man stood in the center of my living room, as if he had always been there. He was even more terrifying up close, his blank face a horrifying void that seemed to pull in the light around him. I could feel his gaze, even without eyes, boring into me, filling me with an overwhelming sense of despair. I forced myself to move, to do something. I lunged at him with the knife, but my hand passed through him like smoke. He didn't even flinch. In that moment, I realized the full extent of my helplessness. This thing wasn't just a man, it was something far beyond my understanding, something I couldn't fight or escape. The faceless man raised a hand, and I felt a crushing pressure on my chest, forcing me to my knees. My vision blurred, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. I could barely breathe, the air around me thick and suffocating. I was drowning in darkness, the room closing in on me. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure lifted. I gasped for air, clutching my chest. The faceless man was gone, as if he had never been there. The lights flickered back on, and I found myself alone in the middle of the room, the knife still in my hand. But I knew this wasn't over. He wasn't gone. He was just toying with me, wearing me down. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep running. I had to end this, once and for all. I gathered everything I had on the faceless man, every piece of research, every scrap of information, and set out to find a solution. There were stories of people who had banished similar entities, rituals that could sever the connection between the spirit and its victim. I didn't know if they would work, but I was out of options. That night, I prepared the ritual, drawing symbols on the floor, lighting candles, and chanting words that felt foreign and ancient on my tongue. I could feel his presence growing stronger, the air thick with tension. The room grew cold, the shadows deepened, and I knew he was coming. As I completed the ritual, the faceless man appeared, more solid than ever before. He reached out toward me, but this time I was ready. I poured everything I had into the ritual, every ounce of willpower, every shred of determination. The candles flickered wildly, the symbols on the floor glowed with a strange light, and the air crackled with energy. The faceless man let out a soundless scream, his form flickering, distorting. The pressure in the room grew unbearable, but I held my ground, focusing on the ritual. And then, with a final burst of light, he vanished, leaving behind only silence. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, but alive. The faceless man was gone, or at least I hoped he was. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive presence lifted. I had won, at least for now. But even as I try to move on with my life, I can't help but feel that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Because some things don't just disappear. They linger, haunting the edges of your vision, waiting to strike when you least expect it. And the faceless man? He's the kind of nightmare that never truly ends.